November 8, 1944. Inside a field hospital tent near Metz, France, a 45-year-old army nurse named Helen Cartwright stood over a soldier with a shattered leg when the telegram arrived. She read it once, both sons missing, presumed captured by German forces near the border, folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket beside her stethoscope. She didn't cry. She returned to the soldier on the table, her hands steady, her jaw locked. For the next 10 years, she would save over 400 lives while carrying a grief so heavy it calcified into something harder: rage. Rage at the men who'd taken her boys. Rage at a war that swallowed children whole. Rage at a God who let mothers outlive sons. And then in March 1955, an envelope arrived with 5 words that would crack that rage wide open and force her to choose between the son she'd lost and the one who'd come back from the dead. She had no idea that one of those telegrams was a lie. Helen Cartwright had tried to stop them. In the summer of 1943, when James, 20 years old, stubborn as his dead father, announced he was enlisting, she'd stood in the kitchen of their Indiana farmhouse and said, You wait 1 more year." But James had shaken his head, and Daniel, 18, quiet and loyal, had simply said, "If James goes, I go." 2 months later, they were gone. By November 1944, that instinct had hardened into certainty. The telegram stayed in her pocket for 3 days. On the third night, alone in the nurse's quarters, she unfolded the telegram and read it again. Missing in action following enemy ambush. Presumed captured. Last seen November 4 near German positions. She'd heard the whispers from soldiers who'd been liberated, the things they wouldn't say out loud, the things that made them wake up screaming. Her boys were in those places now, or they were already dead. That thought didn't break her. It made her colder. She stopped writing letters home. There was no one left to write to. Her husband had died in 1940. Her parents years before that. The farmhouse sat empty, waiting for no one. So she worked. She worked until her hands cramped, until her vision blurred, until she forgot what day it was. She worked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant seeing their faces, and seeing their faces meant imagining what the Germans were doing to them. Winter came. The field hospital moved east, chasing the Allied advance through Belgium and into Germany. But at night, alone, she'd lie in her cot and imagine walking into a German prison camp and finding the officer who'd given the order. She imagined what she'd say, what she'd do. The fantasy was vivid, detailed, and it kept her warm when nothing else did. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe ended. The field hospitals began processing liberated prisoners, skeletal men with hollow eyes and numbers tattooed on their arms. Helen watched them shuffle through the intake lines, and every time a new group arrived, she searched the faces. James had been tall, broad-shouldered, with their father's square jaw. Daniel had been thinner, quieter, with a scar above his left eyebrow from falling out of a tree when he was 6. She looked for those details. She found nothing. Then, in June 1945, a Red Cross officer pulled her aside. His name was Lieutenant Morrison, and he had the kind face of someone who'd delivered too much bad news. He held a folder. "Mrs. Cartwright," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you about your sons." Helen's chest tightened. "You found them. We found records," Morrison said carefully. He opened the folder. Corporal James Cartwright and Private Daniel Cartwright were taken prisoner on November 5, 1944, near Bastogne. They were transported to a detention facility outside Munich. He paused. James was interrogated for 3 days. He died on November 8, the same day she'd received the telegram. Helen stared at the paper in Morrison's hands. Interrogated. That was the word they used when they meant tortured. She thought of James, loud, brave James, who'd climbed trees and broken bones and never backed down from a fight, and she imagined him in a cold room, with men who spoke a language he didn't understand, men who wanted names and numbers and information he didn't have. Daniel was transferred to a labor camp in Bavaria. The records end there. He's listed as missing, presumed deceased, presumed. Helen took the folder from Morrison's hands and read it herself. The German report was clinical, bureaucratic. Cartwright, James, Sepulpure, died during interrogation. 8 Nov 1944. Cartwright Daniel, PVT, transferred 12 Nov 1944. Dachau subcamps, no further record. That meant he died in the camp, starved, worked to death, shot. It meant his body was in an unmarked grave somewhere, mixed with thousands of others. It meant she'd never know exactly when or how, just that it had happened. She handed the folder back to Morrison. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry, ma'am. If there's anything." "There isn't," Helen said. She walked away before he could say anything else. That night, she sat alone in her quarters and unfolded the telegram for the last time. She'd carried it for 7 months, a square of paper that had become softer than cloth from handling. Missing in action. Presumed captured. Now she knew. James was dead. Daniel was dead. Both of them had died in German hands, and there was nothing she could do about it. No one she could scream at. No officer she could find and make pay. The war was over. The camps were liberated. The men responsible were either dead or in custody, and none of it mattered because her boys were still gone. She folded the telegram one last time and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't throw it away. She would never throw it away. It was proof that they'd existed. Proof that someone had cared enough to tell her they were gone. Proof that the rage boiling in her chest was real and justified and hers to carry forever. But carrying it alone was killing her. She requested reassignment to a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, the same region where Daniel had disappeared. She told herself she was needed, that the refugees needed doctors and nurses, that she could help. The truth was simpler. She wanted to walk the same ground her son had walked. She wanted to see what he'd seen, breathe the air he'd breathed, stand in the shadow of the same barbed wire that had held him. Thousands of displaced people, Jews, Poles, political prisoners, slave laborers, wandered between barracks, their bodies skeletal, their eyes empty. Helen set up a clinic in a converted storage shed and worked 18-hour days. She treated dysentery, tuberculosis, infections left to rot for months. And every day, she thought about the Germans who'd run those camps, the officers who'd given the orders, the guards who'd pulled the triggers, the bureaucrats who'd filed the reports. She thought about what she'd do if she ever met one, if she'd scream or cry, or simply walk away. She never got the chance to find out. In the autumn of 1946, Helen returned to the United States. She took a job at a veterans hospital in Illinois, close enough to Indiana that she could visit the farm, far enough that she didn't have to see it every day. The house was exactly as she'd left it, dust on the furniture, 2 empty chairs at the kitchen table. She dusted them once, then stopped. Let them gather dust. Let the whole place fall apart. The hospital became her home. She worked the night shift, moving through rows of beds filled with men who'd survived the war but couldn't survive the peace. But at night, alone in her apartment, she unfolded the telegram and the Red Cross report. She read them over and over, memorizing every word, every date. James tortured and killed on the same day she'd received the news. Daniel lost somewhere in the machinery of a camp system so vast that boys could disappear without a trace. The details didn't make it easier. They made it worse, because now she knew exactly what had been done to them, and she could never unknow it. Years passed. The world moved on. The war became history. Helen kept working, kept existing, kept carrying the weight of 2 deaths that no one else remembered. Then, in March 1955, 10 years, 4 months and 16 days after the telegram, another envelope arrived. But this envelope was different. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain, and the return address was a town in Pennsylvania she didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, handwritten in pencil. Dear Mrs. Cartwright, my name is Daniel Cartwright. I think I'm your son. The floor tilted. Helen read the sentence again. Then again. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. Daniel. Her younger boy, the quiet one. The one who'd followed James into hell and supposedly never come out. The letter continued. I don't remember much. I was found near a displaced persons camp in Bavaria in 1945, with no identification and no memory of who I was. A German family, a widow and her daughter, took me in and cared for me. They said I kept repeating 2 words, Indiana and Cartwright. It's taken me 10 years to piece together who I might be. I found a military record that matches my description, PVT. Daniel Cartwright, transferred to Dachau subcamp, presumed dead. If that's me, then you're my mother. I don't know if you're still alive. I don't know if you want to hear from me. But I had to try. If this is you, please write back. Helen's knees gave out. She sat hard on the kitchen floor, the letter clutched in her hand, and for the first time in 10 years, she cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in the field hospital, but deep animal sobs that shook her entire body. Daniel was alive, but James wasn't. The grief and the rage collided so violently she thought she'd break apart. One son alive meant one son truly, finally, irrevocably dead. The hope she'd buried for a decade came roaring back, but it was a hope soaked in guilt. Why Daniel and not James? Why the quiet one and not the brave one? What kind of mother felt grateful and devastated in the same breath? And underneath it all, a darker thought. A German family saved him. The same people whose government had killed James, whose camps had swallowed Daniel, whose war had destroyed everything, they had saved her son. Helen didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know if she could forgive it, or if forgiveness even mattered. All she knew was that Daniel was alive, and she had a choice. Hold on to the rage that had kept her breathing for 10 years, or let it go and reach for the son who'd come back. She chose her son. That night, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote her reply. She told him about the farmhouse, about his father, about the day he and James had left for the war. She told him about the telegram, The Red Cross report. The 10 years she'd spent believing he was gone. She told him she didn't care if his memory never returned. Didn't care if he couldn't remember her face or his childhood. He was alive. That was enough. 3 weeks later, a train pulled into the station in Illinois, and a man stepped off. He was 29 years old, thin and careful, with eyes that looked older than his years. Helen stood on the platform, her heart hammering, and when he walked toward her she saw it, the scar above his left eyebrow, the shape of his father's hands, the way he held his shoulders. "Daniel?" she said. He stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I don't remember." "It's okay," Helen said. Her voice was steady now, the nurse's voice, the one that had talked boys through surgery and told mothers their sons were gone. "You don't have to remember. I remember enough for both of us." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He stiffened, then slowly, carefully he hugged her back. He didn't remember her, but his body did. She told him about James, how he'd been loud and brave, how he'd died in a German interrogation room on the same day she'd gotten the telegram. She told him about the camps, the displaced persons, the 10 years she'd spent working to forget, and she told him about the rage, the quiet burning rage that had kept her alive when nothing else did. "I hated them," she said quietly. "I hated every German soldier, every officer, every person who'd ever worn that uniform. I wanted them to suffer the way you suffered, the way James suffered." She looked at him, "And then you told me a German family saved you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know why they did it," he said finally. "The woman Frau Weber, she said she'd lost her own son in the war. Maybe that's why. Maybe she just couldn't watch another boy die." Helen closed her eyes. She thought of Frau Weber, a widow in a bombed-out country, taking in a stranger with no memory and no name. She thought of the rage she'd carried for 10 years, the fantasies of revenge, the cold satisfaction she'd imagined if she ever met the people responsible. And she thought of her son, alive because someone had chosen mercy when they could have chosen cruelty. It didn't erase James. It didn't undo the interrogation, the camp, the 10 years of grief. But it was something. "I'm glad she found you," Helen said finally. Daniel nodded. "Me too." In the years that followed, Daniel stayed in Illinois. He found work, married, visited Helen every Sunday. His memory never fully returned. There were gaps that would never be filled, but he learned to live with it. And Helen learned to live with the fact that grief and joy could coexist, that losing one son didn't mean she had to stop loving the one who came back. She kept working at the Veterans Hospital until she was 68. The younger nurses called her a hero, said she'd saved more lives than anyone could count. Helen never felt like a hero. She felt like a mother who'd done what she had to do, who'd kept her hands steady when everything inside her was screaming, who'd survived the worst thing that could happen, and who'd been given against all odds a second chance. On her last day at the hospital, she walked through the ward one final time. She stopped beside a young veteran who'd lost his legs in Korea, a boy who reminded her of James. She adjusted his blanket and squeezed his hand. "You're going to be okay," she told him. He looked up at her and for a moment she saw her son's face. Both of them. "Thank you," he whispered. Helen nodded and walked away. Outside, Daniel was waiting, leaning against his car. When he saw her, he smiled, small, careful, but real. "Ready?" he asked. The March air was cold, but the sun was shining. She thought about the telegram, still folded in her drawer at home. She thought about the field hospital, the displaced persons camp, the 10 years of rage. She thought about James, dead in a room she'd never see, and Daniel, alive because a stranger chose mercy. The rage was still there. It would always be there. But so was her son. "Ready," she said. They drove home together, through a world that had tried to tear them apart and almost succeeded. The empty chair at the kitchen table would always be empty. But the other chair was full, and after 10 years of grief and rage and impossible hope, that was enough. How many other mothers never got that second chair filled?